Everyone knows a hypocrite. The mystery is, they never seem to know it themselves. There is a particular kind of person who speaks loudly about loyalty, yet disappears the moment it costs something. Who preaches honesty publicly and practices deception privately. Over time, something quietly inevitable begins to happen. The mask, however carefully constructed, starts to slip. The confusion around hypocrisy is not simply about moral failure. Most people who behave hypocritically are not deliberate liars. They are ordinary people navigating the gap between who they believe themselves to be and who they actually are. What makes hypocrisy so psychologically fascinating is how invisible it remains to the person committing it. The critical parent who never examines their own wounds. The colleague who complains about micromanagement while controlling everything around them. We assume hypocrisy is a conscious choice, that the hypocrite knows the truth and simply ignores it. But observation of human behavior reveals something more unsettling. The hypocrite is often the last person to see it. Daniel Kahneman's work on cognitive bias showed how powerfully the mind constructs stories to protect the self-image. The mind is not a neutral observer. It is an active defense attorney, building the most favorable case possible. The gap between stated values and actual behavior can therefore grow wide without any internal alarm sounding. The person continues to identify with their ideals rather than their actions, sincerely believing the narrative their mind has written. This is the quiet strangeness of hypocrisy. It does not announce itself. It accumulates in silence, visible only from the outside, until time strips the concealment away entirely. What begins as selective memory gradually becomes a pattern so consistent that even casual observers recognize its shape long before the hypocrite does. Philosophers and students of human nature have been circling this problem for centuries. Marcus Aurelius wrote that people reveal themselves most clearly not through what they declare, but through what they repeatedly do. Carl Jung identified what he called the shadow, the unconscious dimension of personality containing qualities the conscious self refuses to acknowledge. The person who loudly condemns dishonesty often harbors the very impulses they denounce. Jung observed that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we project outward. We see in others the flaws we cannot bear to examine in the mirror. The hypocrite is, in many ways, a person in flight from their own shadow. Sigmund Freud described rationalization as one of the mind's most elegant tools. The ability to produce convincing, noble-sounding reasons for behavior that originated from far less noble impulses. The mind justifies after the fact and presents that justification as the cause. This means the hypocrite is not merely deceiving others. At a fundamental level, they are deceiving themselves. Self-deception is more stable than deliberate lying because it requires no maintenance and generates no guilt. Arthur Schopenhauer argued that the will, the blind, striving force driving human behavior, nearly always precedes rational thought. We act first from desire and ego. Reasoning comes afterward, dressed in borrowed clothes of principle. This ancient observation maps precisely onto what modern psychology has confirmed. That moral reasoning is often post hoc rationalization, a story told to justify what the deeper self has already decided. Understanding this is not an invitation to cynicism. It is the foundation for understanding how sincere people can be hypocrites, and why their exposure is not always the result of malice, but simply of time. The psychological mechanism behind hypocrisy begins in identity. Human beings do not merely have a self, they actively construct and maintain a self-concept, a personal narrative deeply resistant to revision. When new information threatens that self-concept, the mind does not calmly update its model. It defends. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance reduction, the drive to resolve the discomfort created when behavior contradicts belief. The most common resolution is not to change the behavior. It is to reinterpret it. The person finds an exception, a special circumstance, a reason why this instance does not count. The self-concept survives. The pattern deepens. Over time, these exceptions accumulate into a hidden architecture. The person has not told one lie about their values. They have built an invisible structure of reinterpretation that allows them to believe they are consistent when they are not. Robert Greene observed that people reliably rationalize their actions in terms of the nobler motive, even when the true motive is far simpler: vanity, self-interest, or fear. This is not malice. It is the ordinary operation of ego preservation. There is also a temporal distortion at work. The hypocrite remembers good intentions more vividly than bad outcomes, waiting moments they honored their values and quietly minimizing the moments they betrayed them. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction reliably biased toward the flattering version. The person who broke a confidence remembers feeling conflicted. They do not fully remember the choice they made. Friedrich Nietzsche was particularly merciless in examining moral performance. He observed that people often adopt the strongest positions precisely in areas where their own will is weakest, using declaration as a wall built against the impulses it publicly condemns. The loudest moral voices are therefore not always the most consistent moral actors. The intensity of declaration can signal not inner security, but inner conflict. The performance of principle is sometimes a substitute for its practice. Ego protection also operates through selective comparison. The hypocrite judges their own behavior by intentions and others by outcomes. Their own lapses are understandable given circumstances. The same lapses in others reveal character flaws. This double standard is not calculated cruelty. It emerges automatically from the architecture of self-concept. We are always the protagonist of our own story, and protagonists receive context and mercy that supporting characters rarely do. The social environment reinforces the pattern. When people around us consistently reflect our self-image without challenging inconsistencies, the protective narrative grows stronger. Unchallenged, the gap between stated values and lived behavior quietly widens. Jung called the social mask the persona. Over time, people can become so identified with their persona that they genuinely lose sight of the distance between it and the actual self living behind it. There is also the role of emotional avoidance. Confronting genuine inconsistency in one's own character is uncomfortable enough that the mind reliably steers away from it. It is easier to focus on others, easier to stay busy. The mind achieves this avoidance not through dramatic denial but through selective attention, choosing, without realizing it is choosing, what to examine and what to leave in darkness. And then time begins its work. The more years pass, the more data accumulates for those watching. Patterns that once seemed like exceptions begin to look like principles. Inconsistencies that could once be overlooked begin to form a clear picture from the outside. The picture the hypocrite cannot yet see from the inside. Consider the manager who frequently lectures about work-life balance, then sends emails at midnight and grows impatient when people actually leave on time. The stated message and the environment built say entirely different things. Or the friend who speaks passionately about radical honesty, yet becomes evasive the moment a conversation approaches something genuinely uncomfortable about themselves. Honesty in practice turns out to apply to everyone else. In romantic relationships, the pattern appears with particular clarity. The person who claims to value emotional openness but punishes their partner for expressing needs. The one who speaks of deep connection while remaining systematically unavailable. On social media, hypocrisy has found a perfectly constructed stage. People curate public images around values, generosity, humility, social consciousness, while those closest to them observe a private reality bearing little resemblance to the performance. In workplaces, the colleague who speaks about the importance of credit then quietly takes ownership of shared work when a superior is watching. The values expressed in meetings and the instincts expressed in moments of opportunity diverge sharply. Within families, some of the most painful forms unfold across decades. The parent who taught lessons about dignity while modeling neither. The sibling who preaches loyalty while practicing a carefully calibrated form of quiet competition. What is striking in all these situations is how the pattern becomes visible to everyone except the person at its center. Coworkers begin to predict when the value speech is coming. Friends stop taking declarations seriously. The hypocrite begins to lose social currency they may not know they are spending. Trust erodes not through any single betrayal, but through the slow accumulation of small inconsistencies people store quietly, without announcing. Sometimes the exposure is dramatic, a single moment where stated values and actual behavior collide publicly. More often it is gradual. People simply stop expecting the words to match the actions. Children are perhaps the most accurate observers of parental hypocrisy. They do not yet have the training to diplomatically ignore inconsistency. They simply notice. What they notice often shapes their understanding of adults permanently. In public discourse, the same mechanism operates at scale. The politician who campaigns on austerity and lives lavishly. The institution that publishes value statements while operating by entirely different internal logic. The pattern is identical, only the audience is larger. The common thread is time. Given enough time, Behavior reveals character more faithfully than any declaration. Actions speak louder than words, not because words are unimportant, but because patterns are conclusive. There is a particular weariness in people who have watched the same pattern repeat for years. Not anger, something closer to quiet resignation. The recognition that the person has shown them who they are, repeatedly. The painful moment arrives when even the hypocrite's closest allies quietly update their assessments. Those who defended them longest, gave the most generous interpretations, waited longest for alignment, they eventually stop waiting. By this point, no declaration can close the gap. The reputation has been built not from what was said, but from what was done, year after year, choice after choice. One deeper pattern underlying hypocrisy is the relationship between anxiety and moral performance. People who feel secretly inadequate in some dimension often compensate by performing loudly in precisely that dimension. The person anxious about their own generosity talks about generosity constantly. The person uncertain about their integrity invokes it in nearly every conversation. The public emphasis addresses inner worry through declaration rather than inward work. Psychologists also identify moral licensing, the phenomenon where performing a virtuous act grants an unconscious permission to behave less virtuously shortly afterward. The balance sheet, at some level, feels settled. This means visible virtue can paradoxically enable subsequent lapses in less visible contexts. The public goodness and the private inconsistency are not entirely separate. They are, in a disturbing way, connected, one quietly feeding the other. Marcus Aurelius understood that genuine virtue required daily, private effort, not because anyone was watching, but because unobserved moments of choice are precisely where character is actually built. Performance was never the same as practice. Another hidden pattern involves the relationship between criticism and projection. People reliably notice and comment on behavior in others that connects to unresolved dynamics in themselves. The passionate critic of selfishness is often someone struggling with their own. Jung's concept of projection explains this precisely. We externalize the aspects of ourselves we cannot consciously integrate. The hypocrite who loudly denounces a particular failing has, in most cases, a deeply personal relationship with exactly that failing. This pattern is observable in conversation. Notice the topics someone returns to unprompted, the criticisms they repeat across different relationships. These recurring themes are rarely entirely about the targets. They are more often about the speaker. There is also the pattern of compartmentalization, the mind's ability to maintain separate evaluative frameworks for different areas of life without registering the contradiction. The same person can be principled professionally and entirely self-serving personally. This can persist without the person ever integrating the two observations into a coherent self-assessment. The mind maintains the walls between compartments with quiet, effective diligence. Kahneman's research on fast and slow thinking illuminates why this is so difficult to escape. Deliberately noticing and reconciling one's own contradictions demands enormous effort that automatic thinking simply does not perform. Genuine self-knowledge is therefore not automatic. It requires uncomfortable, deliberate effort, the kind people reliably find reasons to avoid. Busyness protects. Distraction protects. Strong emotional investment in self-image protects most effectively. Another layer involves social reinforcement. Within groups, families, organizations, communities, there is often an implicit agreement not to name the inconsistencies of high-status members. The social cost of confronting a hypocrite typically exceeds the cost of simply adapting. This collective accommodation enables the pattern to persist far longer than it otherwise might. The hypocrite moves through a maintained ecosystem that, for a long time, consistently confirms their self-narrative. The tragedy is that the people most invested in preserving a hypocrite's self-image are often those who care about them most. Their love expresses itself as accommodation, which quietly becomes enabling. They protect the person from self-knowledge that would be painful in the short term and genuinely transformative in the long term. In trying to be kind, they inadvertently ensure the pattern continues. There is also the dimension of stress. Under pressure, people revert to deeply conditioned patterns rather than carefully constructed values. This is precisely where hypocrisy becomes most visible, when living the stated values would cost something real. A person's values are not revealed when being principled is comfortable. They are revealed when it requires giving something up: recognition, advantage, convenience. These moments of friction are the real diagnostic. Over years, the people around a hypocrite accumulate a database of these friction moments. They remember which choices were made when values were actually tested. They build their real understanding from this accumulated evidence, not from declarations. Ultimately, the most revealing hidden pattern is this. The hypocrite rarely adjusts their words to match their behavior. They endlessly adjust the interpretation of their behavior to match their words. The commitment is always to the image, never to the underlying reality. Here is the unsettling truth. Most hypocrites are not bad people. They are people whose capacity for self-perception has not kept pace with their capacity for self-presentation. They did not begin with a plan to deceive. They began with genuine ideals, real values, honestly held, that collided with the inconvenient reality of their own limitations, fears, and desires. The self-protective mechanisms that developed were not malicious strategies. They were the mind's ordinary attempts to manage the pain of inconsistency. Small revisions, convenient reframings, selective memory that kept the self-image intact. But these ordinary mechanisms produce real consequences. The people around the hypocrite experience the gap between stated values and actual behavior as a series of small wounds. And those wounds accumulate. Schopenhauer observed that people mistake their motives with such consistency that they are often among the least accurate observers of themselves. Not because they are uniquely dishonest, but because self-protection operates largely outside conscious awareness. This means confronting a hypocrite with evidence of their inconsistency is often genuinely ineffective. Not because they choose to deny truth, but because their perception is structured such that the evidence does not register as intended. They experience your confrontation as misunderstanding. Your evidence feels unfair. The conversation registers as an attack on someone who, from their own perspective, is genuinely trying. The self-concept generates its own defensive epistemology. And yet time does what direct confrontation rarely can. As the pattern repeats, the distance between declared values and observable behavior becomes impossible to attribute to exception. It becomes unmistakably the rule. The people who have watched long enough stop being confused by the gap. They stop being hurt by it. They adjust their expectations to match reality, and quietly withdraw the trust the hypocrite may not know they were losing. This is the quiet, irreversible cost of sustained hypocrisy. It rarely ends in dramatic exposure. It ends in the slow, private withdrawal of genuine connection, people learning, at last, to hold the words at appropriate distance. The hypocrite may continue receiving public affirmation, may maintain the surface appearance of relationships, may never face a decisive confrontation. But the quality of what those relationships actually contain has fundamentally changed. And somewhere, in the moments of honest self-examination that even the most defended person occasionally cannot avoid, the hypocrite senses this distance, though they may trace it to any source except the accurate one. Now consider, with genuine honesty, where this pattern may be operating in your own life. Are there values you hold loudly in conversation, but consistently fail to live out when circumstances make them costly? Is there a quality you criticize in others that has roots in your own unexamined experience? This is not an invitation to self-condemnation. It is an invitation to the more productive discomfort of genuine self-examination. The goal is not to discover you are secretly terrible. The goal is to shrink the gap. Every person who has attempted honest self-assessment has encountered the resistance the mind generates against it. The sudden busyness, rational-sounding deflections, the discovery of urgent tasks precisely when the examination becomes uncomfortable. Notice that resistance. It is itself information. The topics we least want to examine are often precisely where the greatest opportunities for authentic growth are located. Jung believed the most significant work a person can do is to become conscious of their own shadow. Not to eliminate it, which is impossible, but to know it and reduce its power over behavior through clear-eyed acknowledgement. Think about the relationships in your life that have slowly cooled without dramatic incident. Consider whether there are patterns in your behavior within those relationships that you have not yet fully examined. The willingness to sit with that question, genuinely, without rushing to the exonerating explanation, is itself a form of integrity. It is the beginning of the work that prevents the slow, invisible erosion of trust that hypocrisy quietly produces. The way out begins not with resolution, but with curiosity. The genuine willingness to ask whether your behavior matches your values, and to tolerate discovering that sometimes it does not. Intellectual humility is the foundational quality here. The recognition that the mind's self-assessment apparatus is unreliable, that we need honest relationships and regular examination to have any accurate picture of who we actually are. The people who escape the hypocrite pattern are not those who never feel the pull towards self-justification. They are people who have developed the habit of catching themselves in the act and choosing to interrogate the narrative instead of accepting it. This requires behavioral honesty, aligning daily choices with stated values in moments when no one is watching and no social credit can be gained. Character is built precisely in those unobserved moments, and it requires genuine feedback, not the social mirroring of people who love us too much to tell the truth, but the honest reflection of people courageous enough to say difficult things. These relationships are rare and worth protecting. Human beings are imperfect creatures navigating the difficulty of being self-aware without being fully transparent to themselves. Hypocrisy is not an aberration in human nature. It is, in many ways, a built-in feature of a consciousness that must manage both a self-image and a continuous stream of imperfect behavior. What distinguishes those who grow from those who remain trapped is not the absence of contradiction. It is the willingness to face it. The courage to look honestly at the gap, feel the discomfort of seeing it clearly, and begin the slow, imperfect work of closing it. Time exposes hypocrites not because it is cruel, but because it is patient. The question worth sitting with in the quiet after this reflection is this: what would you like time to reveal about you, and are the choices you are making each day actually building toward that? Share your thoughts below.